Have you ever witnessed someone being dismissed simply because they didn't look important? An old man with silver hair, worn-out shoes, and a faded coat, thrown out of first class under the cold stares of people who believe they belong to a higher class. But just minutes later, that very man would shake an entire financial empire. Not with political power, not through media exposure or scandal, but with just one phone call. Today's story won't just surprise you. It will make you rethink the way you judge someone in just the first few seconds. Have you ever caught yourself judging someone at a glance? A worn-out outfit, a slow gait, a suitcase that looks like it's traveled across half the world. Sometimes, just a simple appearance is enough for us to assign value to a person. But what if the very person you dismissed was capable of shaking an entire corporation with a single, subtle move? Heathrow Airport. A gloomy morning. Thick fog clung to the endless glass panels of the terminal. Announcements echoed through the halls. Suitcases rolled rhythmically across the polished granite floor. The world moved in the relentless rhythm of a modern, yet emotionally distant age. In the sea of travelers, no one noticed the old man. James Everett walked slowly through the first-class check-in area, carrying a weathered leather suitcase dulled by time and a pair of old dress shoes whose scuff marks faded with age. He didn't lift his head. He made no eye contact. He simply moved forward, quietly, just like he always did. And yet, each step he took was a silent challenge to the arrogance and prejudice surrounding him. In just a few minutes, when James would take his seat in 1A, the most luxurious spot on Sky Air Global's premier flight, those judgmental stares would recoil, like slaps back at the faces who cast them. And with a single phone call, he would shake the foundations of one of the world's most renowned airline empires. The moment James stepped in the first-class cabin, the air seemed to pause for a beat. Luxury leather seats, warm golden lighting, the hushed elegance of passengers who were all too used to special treatment. But then an uncomfortable silence crept in. All eyes began to turn toward him. No one spoke aloud, but every movement, every quick glance followed by a sudden turn away, every faint furrow of the brow, carried one unspoken message loud and clear. Who was he to be sitting here? A well-dressed woman gently set her wine glass down and whispered to her companion. He looks like a lost old man. The attendants must have made a mistake. A sharply dressed man nearby scoffed. First class really is more accessible these days. He looks like he just came off the subway. Chief flight attendant Sarah, noticing James had taken his seat, immediately spoke into her radio. Seat 1A is occupied by an unfamiliar passenger. Attire not in line with the expected standard. Please verify the manifest. James heard everything, but he didn't react. He simply sat there, back straight, hands resting calmly on his knees, his gaze distant and detached, as though the judgments bouncing off him no longer mattered. Maybe he'd seen those stares too many times to count. Maybe this wasn't the first time, but it would certainly be the last time someone dared to look down on him and still believe they were right to do so. Because in just a few more minutes, every single person in that cabin would come to realize they had just insulted the wrong man. Just minutes after James had settled into his seat, a uniformed figure appeared at the front of the cabin. Two airport security officers walked briskly toward him, faces blank, well-trained in protocol, unmoved by context. "Sir, I'm sorry, but you're in the wrong seat. Please come with us." James calmly held out his ticket. Clear information, boldly printed, Seat 1A. But the guard barely glanced at it before handing it back. No apology, not even the faintest consideration that they might be wrong. "We've received a report. Please cooperate." The cabin fell eerily silent. Passengers nearby turned their faces away or lowered their eyes to their phones, pretending this had nothing to do with them. A few even shook their heads with faint, pitiful smiles. Not for James, but for the mere presence of him. A young man elbowed his girlfriend and whispered, "Did they grab a wrong guy? Or is he just trying to make a scene?" James said nothing. He stood up slowly, his knees cracking softly. No complaints, no resistance, only the unsettling calm of a man who had witnessed this kind of thing far too many times. A few eyes followed him until he disappeared beyond the aircraft door. But they weren't eyes of pity. They were eyes of satisfaction, as if order had just been restored. But they were wrong. The order they clung to so tightly. It was about to be shattered by the very man they just cast aside. And this time, he wouldn't speak with words. He'd speak with power. James Everett stepped off the plane and walked through the cold corridor of Heathrow Airport. A draft from the glass panels tousled his silver hair. But he remained still, not because of the wind, not because of the humiliation, but because he knew this was the moment. He stopped near the security checkpoint, where the usual airport noise seemed to bounce off the glass walls and vanish. James pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. Only 3 names were saved in his contacts. He tapped the first one, Nathaniel Brooks, CEO, Everett Capital Holdings. The call connected after just 2 rings. "Good morning, Chairman Everett. How can I assist you?" James's voice was calm, neither raised nor soft. "I want to pull out all $4.2 billion from Sky Air Global. Immediately. Not a single cent left behind." There was a pause on the other end. A long, heavy silence. Then Nathaniel replied, his tone lower now. "Understood. I'll begin within 5 minutes." James closed the phone and slid it back into his coat pocket. He didn't look back at the plane. He didn't glance toward the eyes that had just judged him. Instead, he walked slowly but firmly, as if he had just issued a command that would bring down an empire. And in truth, he had. Just minutes later, Sky Air Global began to tremble. Transfer requests were abruptly halted. Risk alert systems flashed red. The board of directors received an internal alert. Primary investor is withdrawing all funds. And James? He simply stood there, calm amidst the rush of travelers. A man who looked like a stranger to the world, but had just shaken that world to its core. Just 30 minutes after James Everett's phone call, Sky Air Global was no longer the untouchable airline it claimed to be. An urgent internal bulletin flashed across executive devices. Everett Capital Holdings has officially withdrawn all investment. At first, confusion. Then, panic. Phones rang nonstop in the boardroom. The head of finance sat frozen, staring at a plunging cash flow chart. Red covered every inch of the screen. At Sky Air headquarters, senior executives were summoned all at once. An emergency meeting was called. No one knew exactly what had happened. No one dared to predict how many shareholders would still have faith in the next 24 hours. On the trading floor, Sky Air Global's stock plummeted 19% in just under an hour. Retail investors were in disarray. Whispers became headlines. Sky Air loses key strategic investor. Crisis of confidence or calculated takedown? In the shadows of that chaos, one name began to surface. At first, behind closed doors in private banking circles. Then, on financial forums. And soon, front-page headlines the next morning blared. The silent billionaire behind Sky Air's collapse. Who really controls the fate of the skies? None of the passengers who had sneered at the old man in first class that morning could have imagined. They were witnesses to a downfall sparked by a single misjudged glance. And James? He remained silent. No statements. No interviews. Because for those who once judged him by appearance alone, his silence was now the heaviest verdict of all. Amid the storm of chaos, one name suddenly rose to the center of it all. Martin Voss, CEO of Sky Air Global. He had just exited a tense advisory meeting when he was urgently summoned to the central operations room. The eyes of his senior team were no longer filled with respect, but suspicion and doubt. "What is this about?" Martin snapped, his voice sharp. "Everett Capital has withdrawn all funds. And we just confirmed it was a direct order from James Everett," the CFO replied, eyes avoiding his. The room fell into dead silence. Martin sank back into his chair, a chill crawling down his spine. James Everett, a name he had only heard in passing. A silent investor, never seen, never interfering. And yet this invisible man had just brought Sky Air to its knees. No warning, no presence, just one call. Martin immediately contacted the communications department, demanding a press release to calm the media. But things didn't end there. Less than an hour later, a thick envelope arrived at Sky Air's headquarters, hand-delivered, sealed in black, stamped confidential. Inside was an ultimatum: return the full $4.2 billion investment with interest within 48 hours. Or every confidential document detailing financial misconduct, shady transactions, and personal gains tied to Martin Voss will be sent to the Department of Finance, international media outlets, and independent investigators. No threats, no police, just a cold, calculated declaration, carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to prove. Martin Voss held the envelope, his hands trembling, not out of fear of losing his title, but because he knew the empire he built, brick by brick, was beginning to crack. And James Everett, the man he dismissed with a single glance, was the one holding the final hammer. Before the sun even rose over the London skyline, breaking headlines had already flooded every major financial outlet around the globe. Sky Air faces bankruptcy amid sudden capital pullout. James Everett, the silent investor who brought an airline to its knees. CEO Martin Voss accused of concealing shady deals. Sky Air under investigation. On the stock exchanges, Sky Air shares continued to plummet. Investors fleden masse. Brands that once competed to partner with the airline now issued public statements, canceling or reevaluating their deals. Sky Air's media channels entered full crisis mode. And yet, James Everett was nowhere to be seen. No public appearance, no press release, no defense. But his name, James Everett, was now spoken with a cautious reverence and a hint of fear. A veteran journalist at the Financial Herald wrote, "The world has long scoffed at the quiet ones. But today, a man once dismissed for his humble appearance has forced the entire aviation industry to reconsider how it judges people." At Sky Air headquarters, Martin Voss sat in a locked conference room. He was no longer angry. He was simply silent. The word from James's letter still echoed in his mind. Men like me look down on our entire lives. But one day, when we speak, those who are used to standing above will have no choice but to bow. And he was right. A gesture, a glance, an arrogance that once seemed harmless had triggered an unstoppable chain reaction. James Everett never needed power to prove himself. He only needed silence. And that silence had brought an empire to its knees. That afternoon, James Everett sat alone in a modest room on the 49th floor of a glass tower. The window stretched wide, letting in a flood of daylight. Yet inside him, everything remained still, just as it had been when he left the airport that morning. On the table lay an old phone, the same one he used to make the call. Next to it, a cooled cup of tea and a newspaper whose bold headline read, "The Fall of Arrogance, Sky Air Global's most painful crash in financial history." But James wasn't smiling. He felt no triumph, because victory had never been his goal. What he sought was a reminder that not everyone dressed simply is less, that not everyone who stays quiet has nothing to say, and that this world should learn to listen before it judges. A young assistant entered the room, gently placing a new file on the table. James nodded in thanks and said quietly, "Send copies to the other airlines." Not as a threat, but as a warning. Later that day, airline companies across the globe announced changes to staff training policies, shifting focus towards service attitude and, above all, respect. For everyone, no one truly knew what James Everett did behind the scenes. Only that, in the aftermath, the global airline industry grew a little more humble, a little more willing to listen. James left the office as the city lit up for the night. No one noticed the man in the old brown coat, walking slowly through the rush. But this time, he didn't need to be noticed, because he knew he had left behind something far greater than a name, a quiet mark that changed how the world values human dignity. "I did this so that people like me won't have to endure it again." I dismissed him until I learned he could bring down an entire empire. I used to think I could read people. Years working first class, serving the elite, the business tycoons, the celebrities. I believed a single glance could tell me where someone belonged. And then that morning at Heathrow Airport, I saw him. An old man quietly stepped into first class, wearing a worn suit, a faded suitcase, shoes scuffed at the heel. He didn't carry the confidence of a VIP. No expensive cologne, no air of entitlement. I looked at him, and in that brief, yet very real, moment, I felt uncomfortable. I thought, he must have wandered into the wrong cabin. So I keyed my radio. Seat 1A. Unfamiliar passenger. The attire is not appropriate. Please verify. I didn't ask. I didn't check his ticket. Because I was sure I was right. Because he didn't look like someone who deserved to be here. When he took his seat, the cabin fell into a thick, awkward silence. Passengers whispered, sneered. Looks like someone straight off the subway. First class really lets in anyone now. And I did nothing to stop them. I stayed silent. Deep down, I even agreed. Minutes later, security approached him, polite but firm. Sir, it appears you may be in the wrong seat. He handed over his ticket, clearly marked 1A. But no one cared to really look. They had a report, and he didn't look like someone who deserved an apology. He stood, slowly. No words, no resistance, no blum, only a calm, as if he had lived this moment too many times. When he left the cabin, I felt relieved. I believed I had done my job, preserved standards. I had no idea. I had just insulted the man who could shake the entire airline industry. 2 hours later, alarms went off across the company. Management scrambled. My phone lit up with a message. Everett Capital Holdings has withdrawn $4.2 billion from Sky Air Global. Stock prices nosedived. Emergency board meetings erupted. Panic ensued. And then someone from the tech team muttered, "The man removed from the plane this morning was James Everett." I froze. My heart raced. I couldn't believe it. James Everett, chairman of Everett Capital, holder of nearly 30% in strategic shares. A man who could topple an airline with a single phone call. I remembered his eyes that morning. The way he sat, calm, upright, like he was silently testing the world. And we failed. I felt deeply ashamed. Not because he was a billionaire, but because I had once believed, if someone doesn't look successful, they don't deserve respect. I judged him by his clothes, his suitcase, his simplicity, not by his character, not by his humanity. I looked at him with disdain, and now that very look haunts me. He didn't yell. He didn't demand. He simply walked away and made us all bow our heads in shame with a lesson no training manual ever taught. But perhaps the part that hurts the most isn't that I was wrong about Mr. Everett. It's that I forgot where I came from. I, too, was once a child growing up in a poor neighborhood, wearing secondhand shoes, no-brand clothes, mocked at school for not being fancy enough. I remember the stares, the whispers, the rejections, just for being less. Back then, I swore, I'll rise. I'll prove myself. And I did. I worked hard. I climbed. I became head attendant, my dream role. But somewhere along the way, instead of showing compassion to those like the old me, I became someone who looked down. I thought it was a victory. They once looked down on me. Now I decide who's worthy. How tragic. Only after meeting Mr. Everett, a man I unknowingly disrespected, did I truly wake up? Value isn't found in suits or status. It's in how you see others, especially those who offer you nothing in return. And if you want to be respected, you must first give respect, not because someone is rich or poor, not because they're loud or quiet, but because they're human, just like you. From that moment on, I vowed, no matter who walks through those cabin doors, respect will always come first. So if you're hearing this story, I'm not telling it to be forgiven. I'm telling it as a reminder, to myself and to you. Never let your eyes determine someone's worth, because the person you look down on today might be holding your fate tomorrow. And sometimes, the quietest ones, they're the most powerful of all. James Everett never needed to be recognized. He didn't need to stand on a podium, nor did he need an apology. The only thing he left behind was a silent yet thunderous reminder. Because he knew, some people stay silent not because they are weak, but because they are waiting for the right moment to make the world listen. Sky Air paid the price, not just for losing an investor, but for losing respect for a human being. And what about you? Will you keep judging others by what you see on the outside? Or will you learn to look deeper, so you'll never have to regret it? If this story moved you, leave a comment. I choose respect. And let's share this message together with the world. The story of James Everett didn't just leave us stunned. It left us with a powerful lesson. Never judge a person by appearance alone. A worn coat, a slow gait, a quiet demeanor. They say nothing about someone's strength or worth. In a world that moves too fast, where we often judge each other in just a few seconds, James was a wake-up call. He didn't need power to prove himself. He didn't need to speak to demand justice. He only needed one call, to bring an arrogant empire to its knees. And I believe, deep down, we've all been misjudged before, dismissed, overlooked, made to feel like we didn't look the part. But like James, what matters most is keeping our dignity and self-respect. Because sooner or later, the world will hear the ones it once ignored. If this story touched something in your heart, please leave a comment with the words, "I choose respect." And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Talk Story, so you won't miss the next story, the next journey, the next message that could move your soul. Because here at Talk Story, we don't just tell stories. We offer reminders to help you believe in yourself more and treat this world with a little more kindness.